Welcome to Sunday School at First Baptist Church, Williamsburg. We are so glad to have all of you being a part of this, and we've got some fantastic class members who are open for discussion today. I'm Norma Dunstan. Let me introduce or have them introduce themselves. Karen, why don't we start with you?
Okay, I'm Karen Stevens. I've been a member or attending First Baptist Williamsburg. I was thinking about it today, 69 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's a long time. It's kind of scary.
You were a bed baby then.
I was part of the cradle club.
Oh, that's fun. All right, George.
I'm George Ramey, and I've been a member 50 years.
Oh, wow. And
Eric? I'm Erica Harris, and I've actually been a member 54 years.
Okay. Oh, wow.
So I'm the new kid on the block.
I'd have to do the math to figure out how long I've been a member. We came in 1983. You do the math. But we're delighted to have you. This is a very interesting topic today. We are looking at the very last chapter of Exodus. It's a lot has happened to the Hebrew people in the book of Exodus. The first half of Exodus is the escape from slavery in Egypt, and they're in the splitting of the Red Sea, and a lot of the involvement of the escape of the second half of Exodus is a lot of commentary said is the people learning to not be slaves, the people learning to live in freedom. They're also learning who this God is who has led them out of Egypt. They've had some issues along the way, but let me begin by asking, what does it mean to you to experience the presence of God? How do you know you are in the process of experiencing the presence of God?
I've not had any fire or splitting of the seas, and I think probably my experiences have been more in a quiet, that still small voice that you hear when you take the time to be quiet enough to hear it.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Many people experience God in many different ways.
Yes.
And no one person has a lock on this. And the experiences in the Old Testament, we find God experienced in 100 different ways. So oftentimes, when we have a special experience, we want to make it to be the only experience.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not the case. And I have been in a religious service in which I felt the presence of God in the presence of others. And then I've been on a mountaintop by myself, and I think I feel the presence of God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think sometimes it's just a feeling or a sense of peace and comfort. It's very relational, I think, sometimes.
And as George said, it's very individual. God speaks to us on a very individual basis. For me, one of the most, I guess, the still quiet voice that Karen spoke of, I was thinking about that a lot this week because I had a particular event that really spoke to me at a time when I was under great stress. I remember sitting on the screened-in porch of my in-laws' house on a hot, unair-conditioned day in August in Richmond, Virginia, holding a baby. I was going through some real crises at the time, and I remember just being in deep prayer. Just what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? It was a prayer that had been going on for several weeks, actually. And then in the midst of that, there was suddenly this sense, not so much a word, but I could almost hear within my mind the word listen. That's all. Just listen. And I remember stopping my constant prayers. While I was holding the baby, I was absently singing to keep Emily quiet, get her to go to sleep. And when I stopped to listen, what I heard was me singing the doxology over and over and over again. It struck me so strong that God, whatever was going on, God was present. He was with me. I didn't find out what I needed to do that day, but I knew God was with me wherever the path would take. And I've been thinking about that because one of the questions the lesson asks is, how do you prepare for the presence of God? How do you prepare yourself to be attuned to the presence of God? And I was thinking, now where was I? I was praying. I wasn't in church. I was in, it must have been 95 degrees on that screened-in porch. It wasn't particularly comfortable, but I was praying. I was open to listen. So I've been thinking about that a lot this week. As I said, go ahead.
One of our problems is that we think that if we pick up the telephone and dial God, he will be there to answer. And oftentimes God leads us to our own personal creation of who we are and what we become.
Mm-hmm.
And so we think if I go to church, God's there. If I go somewhere else, God isn't there.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't direct God. God is present. We just have to recognize him and to seek God. And so in a worship service in church, there's a reason why they call the opening prayer the invocation. We invoke the presence of God. We have become so familiar with God in our prayer life and our conversations that God is our buddy next door and we turn to him. But God is a remote and fantastic God, but it's hard for us to know him even though he knows us.
We're sort of constantly in learning mode, aren't we?
Right.
Let's see. Chapter 40, this last chapter of Exodus, reads almost like instructions to set up a room for an event. It's sort of interesting that way, put this here and put that there, and this goes here. So initially, the readings sounds a little strange to us. Erica, would you begin by reading Exodus 40, 16 through 21, please?
Sure. Moses did everything just as the Lord commanded him. So the tabernacle was set up on the first day of the first month in the second year. When Moses set up the tabernacle, he put the bases in place, erected the frames, inserted the crossbars, and set up the posts. Then he spread the tent over the tabernacle and put the covering over the tent, as the Lord commanded him. He took the tablets of the covenant law and placed them in the ark, attached the poles to the ark, and put the atonement cover over it. Then he brought the ark into the tabernacle and hung the shielding curtain and shielded the ark of the covenant law as the Lord commanded him.
It's sort of interesting, isn't all these different items? Moses erects the tabernacle. He laid the sockets. He put up the boards. He inserted the bars. He erected the pillars. He set up the lampstands. In the chapters previous, we read about the people of Israel creating these things, creating the pillars, creating the lampstands, and all these things, inlaying them with gold. If you skim through those chapters, it's rather fascinating how involved it was. All the different items that were required. George, do you have anything to add to that?
Oh, I could talk on and on about the Ark of the Covenant because it is such a big place in the Jewish religion, beginning with Moses. But what is the Ark of the Covenant? And what was its shape and design? Scholars have wrestled with this for 5,000 years. But I was interested that in one of the modern English translations, they refer to it as the covenant box, not an ark, but a box. But it became very famous a generation ago, the Raiders of the Lost Ark with Indiana Jones. And with Indiana Jones, this box, the Ark of the Covenant, became a magical device that could have supernatural powers in and of itself. That is not a part of Scripture.
No. Well, let me move on.
Except at one point where David touched the ark, and one of the helpers moving the ark was struck dead, and so that's the basis of Indiana Jones. But that's not my understanding of the ark.
Oh well. What I want you to notice a refrain that is repeated all the way through this chapter. Thus Moses did according to all that the Lord had commanded him. This is refrained all the way through. What do you think the purpose of adding this refrain in there, in this passage was?
To show that he was a faithful servant.
It showed obedience, didn't it? Doing what God told him to do.
That God is the source of power, not Moses.
So the people of Israel are acting in obedience. They haven't always. They had some issues with a little golden calf one time. But it's but they have gotten beyond that point. In spite of everything, they have arrived at the scripture tells us at the first day of the year, at the first day of the first month of the year, for setting up the tabernacle, exactly as God has instructed them to do. The work in preparing this probably took months. It probably, they were focused on this for a long time. And it could be that everything was already done and then they were waiting for the first day of the year. That would make it pretty neat, don't you think? But oh well. George, would you read verses 30 through 38?
Moses set the basin between the tent of meeting and the altar and put water in it for washing, with which Moses and Aaron and his sons washed their hands and their feet. When they went into the tent of meeting and when they approached the altar, they washed as the Lord had commanded Moses. He set up the court around the tabernacle and the altar and put up the screen at the gate of the court. So Moses finished his work. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled upon it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Whenever the cloud was taken up from the tabernacle, the Israelites would set out on each stage of their journey. But if the cloud was not taken up, they did not set out until the day that it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and fire was in the cloud by night, before the eyes of all the house of Israel at each stage of their journey.
Wouldn't it be nice to have something that visual to let you know where to go and what to do, to know where God wants you to do? This cloud is not unfamiliar to them at this point. Karen, I gave you a couple passages earlier in the day. Do you mind reading those?
Okay, let me make sure I've got the right ones. Exodus 14, 19, and 20.
Mm-hmm.
Then the angel of God, who was going before the host of Israel, moved and went behind them. And the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them, coming between the host of Egypt and the host of Israel. And there was the cloud and the darkness, and it lit up the night without one coming near the other all night.
It's pretty cool, isn't
So
it?
there was a measure of protection there. I have a question, and it's going to show my religious ignorance, but was this mobile?
Yes, the tabernacle.
Okay, so they had to set it up every time they moved. Okay, that's what I gathered from the readings.
Yes, it was something that they set up and they moved. Everything was made to be moved as they moved.
As they moved. Okay.
And
just wanted to make sure.
Why do you think, and Karen, why do you think that was? Why do you think it was movable?
Well, they needed to be able to see that and have the reassurance and the protection of the cloud and the division of the darkness and the light.
And it's very much.
And when the cloud wasn't there, they didn't go anywhere.
Right. Yeah, there was this idea that God was in their midst. God was there. He was present.
Now this comes to the purpose of the Ark of the Covenant.
Mm-hmm.
The Ark of the Covenant is the presence of God throughout the Old Testament. And for the Jews, they carried it with them when they traveled. Mm-hmm. And then when they were taken prisoners and taken to Babylon at the end of the destruction of Jerusalem, they were completely destroyed because the Ark of the Covenant, based on most historical sources, was demolished by the Babylonians. And for them, it meant that God was killed, because that's how they looked at it. God had been killed and God had abandoned his people. So, but for us who are Baptist, raised in the Baptist tradition, we find much of this hard to understand, because many denominations and Christian groups use physical symbols. I'm talking about buildings and other objects to represent God's presence. God is present on the mountaintop. But for the Israelites, God is only present when the Ark of the Covenant is there, because it was his throne. And as a part of my dissertation, that Ark of the Covenant is also described in the Psalms as the chariot of God, as God travels across the skies from place to place.
Well,
so,
earlier, last week's lesson, we talked about the Ark of the Covenant, and the emphasis was that that God was not in the Ark of the Covenant or in the tabernacle. He was above it.
Right.
It wasn't, God could not be contained. He was present. He moved with them. Maybe if they had studied their scripture a little more, they would have known that. So one of the questions, and y'all have already talked about that, is why do you, the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire was out ahead of them earlier in Exodus. It was sort of leading them on. Now suddenly this pillar of cloud fire, which was in the distance, is suddenly there among them. It descends upon the temple or tabernacle. I want you to know I wrote tabernacle on the top of every single page because every time I went over this, I kept saying temple.
But the temple is the same design. The temple is uses the patterns of Exodus for how the temple was built. So the temple and tabernacle are essentially the same, has the same purpose and same design. That's where you have trouble with it.
All right. Well, but so suddenly, instead of God being distant, he is there. He's right there in their midst. Can you imagine being part of the group of people and seeing this happen? They have been spending months building all these things, building lampstands, building the ark, building pillars, building boards to hold up the tent. All these things, they have been building these things. It all gets put together. One of the commentaries says that even though it says Moses set all this up, chances are one commentary said he was actually the quality control supervisor. So he probably was in charge of saying, okay, you put this pillar in this socket, you put this board here, you put the lampstands here. So there was always this, they're taking part in this, they're putting everything together just as God has commanded them to do. Mm-hmm. That refrain that keeps coming back, just as God has commanded them to do. It was, so what was at a distance is suddenly this pillar of cloud is in the tabernacle. It has filled the tabernacle. And they don't go in there. Why do you think they don't go in there? It's almost like they're not allowed in there. Why do you think it was?
Maybe
at
not
that
worth
moment, it was God's house, and God was there, and we humans are not allowed to be in the presence of God.
Okay. Karen, what were you going to say?
I just said maybe not worthy.
Mm-hmm. I think that's right. It was not where they belonged at that time. And even though they have built this thing from ground up, it's not theirs. It doesn't belong to them. Mm-hmm. One commentary said it was very similar to a contractor building a house and keeping the keys and coming in and out of the house after the new owners have moved in. You don't do that. It's very much the idea that this was God's house. You entered at his invitation. I wanted to read a quote to you. One of the commentaries was written by John Durham, and I'd like to get your reaction to it because I thought this was very interesting. John Durham in his commentary said, Yahweh among his people, not in mighty deeds, not in his rescue or in his provision or in his guidance or in his judgment or at a distance or on a forbidding mountain, but there in the midst. How do you respond to that comment? It struck me as so interesting that how many times when we're praying, it's not so much that we need something in particular, we just need God. We just need God. That we're not alone in all this, that He is present, He is in our midst. That's why that struck me so strongly, was just, even though He had rescued them from Egypt, even though He had split the Red Sea, even though He had provided manna and had provided drink and had guided them and had some pretty stiff judgments on them. If you read through Exodus, He wasn't way up ahead in this cloud. He wasn't on this forbidding Mount Sinai. He was there, right there. And the term that came to mind to me was Emmanuel, God with us. We who have encountered Jesus gotten a different sort of view of that. Erica, were you about to say something?
No, I mean, I agree with what you just said. It's God with us. When you talk to God, and George mentioned this earlier, you don't always necessarily hear an answer because He leaves some of it to you. But I think when you're listening, He'll guide you. But it's, yeah.
Okay. Just told us we've got 10 minutes before they're going to cut us off. So we've got to be smart about these next 10 minutes. Karen, one of the reasons I really wanted you to be a part of this discussion is because of your music. Because part of worship is I find that I experience the presence of God so much in music. How do you find God with us in the midst of the music?
The times that I have been most affected by the music that we're singing, more so than when I'm playing, because I'm too mechanical to think about playing the notes, but in singing, it's almost overwhelming sense. And this occurred just a few weeks ago with Praise First. We were singing and I had to quit. I got that almost overwhelming sense of God's presence and what we were singing and what we were saying. And that's about all I can, about the only way I can express it. But the music does speak to me, and that's why I continue with those young folks and Praise First. But it is a very important part of my worship.
I have been really blessed by Praise First, and I miss the choir because there are times when the words seem to speak exactly what I need to speak. I guess it was last week or a couple weeks ago, pronounce it for me, Kyrie eleison. It just spoke to exactly where I was at that time. And I remember tearing up because it spoke to me so clearly in the midst of all that was going on. The power of that moment of the tabernacle being filled with the glory of God was a visible affirmation of God among us. Moses had been telling them this, and of course they had gotten some pretty solid clues through the months previous. The pillar of fire of cloud and or fire way up ahead of them, or the or the manna and the water God providing for them. They had gotten some pretty solid clues. Moses coming down from Mount Sinai with the 10 Commandments. I think that was some pretty strong hints of God's presence. But to be able to stand there and see it at that moment, what a glorious moment that must have been. It was such an affirmation of God among us, God in the holy places, but also in their living spaces. He was right there in their midst. So wherever they they traveled, whenever, anytime, God was among them. God was present. So how do we prepare? How do we prepare ourselves so that we can be open to the presence of God, open to his presence? What hinders us? Let's start with that way. What hinders us from being attuned to God's presence?
I think it's just human nature to think that we can solve all our own problems, that we'll just figure it out. Mm. And when we realize we can't, that's when we want to talk to God about it rather than in the reverse.
Mm-hmm. Or sometimes we think that what our issues are really aren't worthy of God's help or just speaking to him and asking for guidance or what to do or how to do it. And that once upon a time, many years ago, I was in a young couples class and one of the couples said, they prayed about whether or not to buy a car. And that struck me. I just had never thought about it. I mean, to me, buying a car is physical, is something that we do. And do I have enough money in the bank to do it, or do I have enough to come in? And what everybody in the world asks God about buying a car, keeping him pretty busy. And that just kind of struck me and made me think about the kinds of things that maybe we should be asking God about or asking for guidance.
We're closing up. It's signaling me all sorts of interesting things here. But a couple of things I thought about is just plain busyness and being distracted. Sitting in your prayer time and also making the list of what you needed to do during the day. Just being so easily distracted. There's that. There's being so busy. And having children in worship with you can be extremely distracting from worship. But but I think where we come is, how do we experience the presence of God? How do we prepare our hearts for that? Again, as we began this, it's very individual. It's it's in prayer, it's in preparation, it's taking time to put our full focus on God. It was in one of the commentaries, I think it was the Sunday school the Sunday school commentary, it said the people have been called to make God a central part of their lives. And so are we. We are called to make God a central part. And there's so often that we categorize different parts of our life. This part we'll let God deal with, and this part, don't worry, God, I've got this. It's but God has asked to be a central part of all our lives, not just worship. Another remark from the commentary. We've got a minute to go, and I'm going to do this, and then we will have to close out. It says, some days we wonder if we will ever escape the periods of time in the wilderness or make it to the promised land. But like them, we keep moving. We keep seeking God's leadership, and we keep finding strength to overcome whatever obstacles are in our way. I want to thank all of you. You have been a blessing, and thank you again. I hope to teach with y'all again. And
Thank you.
And thank you. And
thank you.
I'm going to have to unrecord us, or it's going to cut us off. So thank you again very much, and we will continue this conversation another time.
Okay.
Hold on just a moment.